not with us, haven't been with us last week, we started a series that has been focusing upon love and what is love. Because for all of us in the midst of life, in the midst of the relationships we have around Thanksgiving, I'm sure one of the things that we celebrate, one of the things that we give thanks for are people's love for us and our ability to love others. But love is one of those well-worn words, right? It's a word that we use to describe many things. Sometimes it's more around our likes and our preferences. Sometimes we'll go to the well of love when it's really about an emotion that we feel. And oftentimes love can be based around different conditions that we have in our life or the reality of how people respond to us. But for our conversation, we want to come back to this word and have a better understanding of what is love. What is love when we talk about God's love for us? What is it when we talk about our love for others? What does it start to look like? What does that start to experience in the midst of life? And so we have been coming back. Last week we started, and the next couple of weeks we'll continue to kind of work through it. But last week, if you weren't with us, we landed on a place of understanding that the love that God desires for us and the love that he desires us to show others is not simply based upon just the emotions, not just simply based upon our preferences, not just simply based upon conditions, but is found in this one word called commitment. A willingness to step beyond just how we feel. A willingness to step beyond just how others may treat us and land on this place of a committed love. Well, that's kind of step one, right? Because we can talk about, yes, I am committed, and yes, we in weddings we often have vows where we make commitments and we make promises. But the next step is to then ask, well, what are we committed to? What does this level of commitment look like? And so this morning we're going to look at one particular element of a committed love. And it's my hope that in understanding this, we'll have a greater respect for how God loves us and then how we are called to love others. And so we're going to turn to a passage that we started at last week. We're going to go to it every week. It's 1 Corinthians 13. Now, to get you kind of caught up to speed, because some of us may or may not be as familiar with the Bible, and we can just kind of land in a passage and we can wonder, okay, what exactly does this mean? Well, 1 Corinthians was written close to 2,000 years ago by a great follower by the name of Paul. And he was writing to a group of Christians in the city of Corinth, think modern-day Greece. And the similarity between the Corinthians and really the reality of most people in that day is that as the movement of Jesus was growing, people were wrestling with this question. What does it look like to follow Jesus in a culture that is going the other direction? And what's amazing about this is that I think this is the same reality that perhaps we wrestle with in our own lives as well. That when it comes to belief in Jesus, do you ever notice that Jesus doesn't simply say, believe in me? He says, come and follow me. And so what does it look like to follow Jesus in the midst of all of life when culture sometimes wants to go in a different direction? And so we're going to read this passage from 1 Corinthians to help us understand, what does a committed love begin to look like? And although these are words that were initially spoken, actually written, almost 2,000 years ago, my hope is that they are words that speak to all of us today.
Love is patient. Love is kind.
It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud.
It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered.
It keeps no records of wrongs.
Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth.
It always protects.
Always trusts.
Always hopes.
Always perseveres.
Love never fails.
And so as we turn to this passage, in many ways there's a lot of sound bites there, right? There are words that we can say to others, words that maybe we can pen on a card. But the place we land is, what does this begin to look like? What is the overarching perspective that I believe ultimately God wants us to know first and foremost about his love, but then also secondly, the kind of love that we are called to show others? Because as I start to read through this list, as I mentioned last week, there's a lot of action involved in it, right? When it talks about love being patient, or it talks about love being kind, or it talks about love not boasting, or how love is not rude. Those are all action steps, and I'm sure for all of us in this room, those are realities, those are steps that we've taken in our life, and we can understand that. But I think there's something even greater going on under the surface. Because in order for us to be patient, in order for us to be kind, in order for us to not be rude, in order for us to not boast, what does this type of love look like? And there's one phrase that Paul mentions in this passage that I just want to focus on here today. Because I think in many ways it starts to summarize what a committed love starts to look like. And it's in this phrase: love is not self-seeking. Love is not self-seeking. I think one of the great realities of the love that God not only shows to us, but the love that God desires that we begin to show to others, is a love that is not first focused upon ourselves. You see, I think in my own life, when I start to realize where an emotional love or where a conditional love begins to fall apart, is because I start to think that it is all about me. You see, a self-seeking love says, I'm going to love based upon how I feel. A self-seeking love says, I am going to love based upon how you may respond to me. But a committed love says, even though I may not feel like loving, even though I may not get the response I had wanted or had hoped or expected from you, I will still show love because I am committed to you. As I take a bit of a step back, I start to realize, as you pause and you reflect upon it, how this can be a challenge in life. But the reality, I'm not sure if this is good news or this is just more news that says you're not alone in the room on this one, is that this has not been a problem that simply we face in our life. This is not just simply a problem that you say, I'm a follower of Jesus or I love God, and why do I continually focus upon myself? The reality is that this has been ongoing for a very long time. If you have a Bible and you want to turn there or just kind of continue to listen, there's a passage in Mark chapter 10, and it actually begins in verse 35. And it's towards the end of Jesus' ministry. And so up until this point, Jesus has done a couple of things. One is he's gathered a group of 12 men to really spend a lot of time with him. He's really focusing in on these 12. Now, there are other people around Jesus. There's other people who are around him and know him. But Jesus is really focusing upon 12. They would have spent the most time with him. They would have seen the majority of the miracles. They would have not only heard the teaching, but they would have had essentially backstage passes to Jesus, right? That after Jesus would do something publicly, they would be able to go back afterwards and Jesus would kind of walk them through it a little bit. So if anyone would have understood what Jesus was all about, let me rephrase that. If anyone should have had the ability to understood what Jesus was all about, it would have been these 12. But then within the 12, there was another 3, Peter, James, and John. And they had even greater access to Jesus than anyone else. Just kind of file that away for a moment. I'm going to come back to it. It's been late in Jesus' ministry. And Jesus has told his disciples on 2 other occasions that they're actually going to go to Jerusalem and that Jesus is going to be handed over, he's going to be betrayed, and he's eventually going to give his life for others. And so Jesus tells his disciples this very same thing a 3rd time. He tells his disciples, we're going to Jerusalem. They don't think it's a good idea to go to Jerusalem. But Jesus explains to him everything that is about to happen. And to summarize, it's essentially Jesus saying, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to give my life for others. We good? We're clear? So if we don't get this, we won't understand what happens next. All right? Here's what happens next. Jesus has just said to his disciples, we're going to Jerusalem, I'm going to give my life for others. And then James and John, right? They're part of the inner 3. They come up to Jesus and they have a question. And the question is this. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Did you get that? Jesus just said, I'm about to sacrifice my life. You have been following me for a very long time. It's all about focusing upon others. And it's like it just goes right over his disciples' heads because they go to him and say, hey, Jesus, that's great and all. And that Jerusalem thing is really important and all. But maybe before that happens, we want you to do for something we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Talk about missing the boat on what Jesus is trying to teach, right? But if I'm being honest, at times I start to see that reality in my life as well. That when I start to think about my relationship with God, or when I start to think about church, my focus is not so much upon what I can do, but rather, God, what are you going to do for me? Or put a little closer to the point, what is this church going to do for me? And I love what Jesus does next. Because he doesn't straighten them out right away. He's like, okay, I'll bite. What is it that you would like me to do for you? And then James and John say to Jesus, when you enter into your glory, we've heard you talking a lot about your kingdom. We want to be your guys. I want to be on the left, and my brother wants to be on your right. Because Jesus, you're entering into your kingdom. You're going to become really important. People are really going to notice you, and we want to be there as well. Essentially what they're saying is, Jesus, we want our needs met, and we think you are the one who can deliver it. And then Jesus says, you guys have no idea what you're asking. And they're like, yeah, no, we're good. We can do whatever you ask of us, Jesus. Clearly, this is a conversation that wasn't behind closed doors. Because the other 10 disciples hear what's going on. And the passage tells us that they become indignant. They are annoyed. And you can at first think, well, maybe they're annoyed because they have missed what Jesus has been teaching. No. They're annoyed because they want those same 2 places. And so here's the context. Jesus has been spending not days, not weeks, not months with these people, years with them, serving others, telling them stories about serving others, showing them the importance of serving others. And the first moment they get, they're like, Jesus, what are you going to do for me? I think this is a challenge in the midst of life. That one of the ways we go against the grain of culture is by recognizing that the question we should be asking is not, what will you do for me? but rather, how can I serve you? I'm going to put up on the screen how Jesus responds to them. And so Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be a servant. And whoever wants to be first must be a slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." I can sit there and I can think, I wonder what these disciples must have thought. Did it begin to sink in? The understanding that the love that Jesus shows, the committed love, has an other-centered focus. It's not a love that says, you must come and serve me, but rather it is a love where I will serve you. And this is the amazing thing about Jesus' love, that it is a love that is seen in commitment through an act of service. The greatest act, the act of willing to lay down his life for our sake and our benefit. I wish I could say that following this conversation that Jesus' disciples just suddenly got it. And they're like, oh my goodness, I totally make sense. So sorry, Jesus. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time, but if you jump to John chapter 13, this is another event. Now it is the night before Jesus is about to be arrested, the following day Jesus to be crucified. And they're celebrating the Jewish feast of Passover. And in part of their tradition, whenever you'd enter into someone's home, you would wash their feet because they're wearing sandals and they're dirty and they're nasty. And so they don't want nasty feet on the carpet. You know, you want to clean it up a little bit. So you wash people's feet, right? Well, Jesus' disciples have rented out a place where there is no other host. There are no other servants. And I really wonder if Jesus set this up to see if his disciples had figured anything out. Guess what? They all sat down at the table, and before they ate, everyone started to look around. None of the disciples got up to wash anyone's feet. Even after Jesus had spoken these words, they still didn't figure it out. And so what does Jesus do? Jesus stands up, takes off his outer garment, wraps a towel around his legs, and starts to wash his disciples' feet. See, the reality of God's love for us is found in his desire not to simply be served, but for him to show his service of others. For him to willingly lay down his life for you and for me. To show the love that God requires of us. It's a love that is based upon a commitment to say, I will put the needs of others ahead of my own. Great words to say. Words we'd probably underline in a Bible or think about and put up on a wall, but how does it become a reality in our life? Because I don't know about you, but I can relate to these disciples in Jesus' life. That Jesus asks me to do something. Jesus shows me how to do something. And I continue to fail to do it. And so how do we start to create this sense of posture in our life? How does it start to become a reality in our life and in the life of the church? How do we get beyond the conversation of just simply saying, whether we say it out loud or whether we think it in our hearts, of simply saying, well, what am I getting out of this? As opposed to saying, what am I willing to give? I want to suggest 3 things that are helpful in my life, that begin to make this focus on others more sticky in my life, that it starts to stick, so that it doesn't just simply become a phrase I say, but it starts to become a reality that I live. 3 things. The first thing is I've realized that if I want to be focused upon others, if I want to serve others well, I need to be intentional in the small things. Intentional in the small things. Because I am convinced that it is in the small things that we begin to create a posture of loving others. You know, oftentimes we think of love in the grand gestures, right? And we're going to talk a lot more about this next week. But just real quickly, oftentimes we think of, well, in the big moments, in the anniversaries, in the birthdays, in the trips, in the things, that if I get this right, then everything else will be covered off, right? But we know that in any relationship, that doesn't really cut it, right? What makes a relationship strong, what makes a relationship stick, is not just simply the grand gestures. Yes, they are helpful, but it's often seen in the small things. Because I am convinced, if I don't position myself to serve others in the small things, there's less of a chance that I'm going to step up in the big ones. And so what are some of the things you can start to look at today or tomorrow or this coming week that you start to create for yourself a focus to say, how can I serve others? Don't just simply wait and look for the grand gestures, because pretty soon all the small things will start flying by you. I think that's exactly what Jesus did with his disciples. He sat down at a table and is like, who is going to stoop and wash someone else's feet? Anyone? Anyone? And so maybe it's as simple as, this is Thanksgiving weekend, and I know you're all probably, maybe you haven't had it yet, or maybe later on this afternoon, or maybe tomorrow you're going to have a Thanksgiving dinner. And I know the reality of my approach to Thanksgiving dinner. You eat well, you have that turkey, and then you have that bit of a turkey coma afterwards, and you look over and you see out of the corner of your eye a whole mess of dishes piling up. And so you look the other way, and the prayer inside of you goes a little something like, please God, let someone else stand up and go in there quickly, right? What if you were the first to go? How does that start to position yourself to serve others well? What if this week when you're at the grocery store and you're like kind of moving towards the checkout, and you see someone else is moving as well, and they got a few more items than you, and you pick up the pace a little bit just to get in there ahead of them? Come on, I should see more heads nodding. I've seen you at No Frills, people. What if you just backed up the pace and let them go in front of you? What if when you're angling for that last parking spot, and you've done the lap a couple times already, and you see another car coming, you just motion for them to go in? What if when you hear someone telling a story about something really cool that they did, that instead of thinking this next story you're going to tell, you actually listen to what they're going to say? I realized in my life, one of the ways that I act out serving others and not being so self-focused is recognizing, and I get this, as a preacher, I get this, I don't need to always have the last word. And so how can you be intentional this week in the small things? Because I'm convinced if we're going to live this life of other-centeredness that Jesus calls us to live, it's got to start with the small things. Second thing I realize in my life to make this work is I need to celebrate and not compete. I need to celebrate and not compete. That too often, instead of serving others, there's like this sense of competition of, well, if they've done this, then I need to do this better. What does it just mean if I start to celebrate what others are doing? It takes the attention and the focus off of me. And then the third one is trust the process. We live in the age where we want results, results, results. And sometimes we approach our faith with God in that way as well. We may walk out of here and you may think, okay, I'm going to do those. I'm going to put those things into practice. I am going to put others ahead of me in the small things. I'm going to celebrate. I'm not going to compete. And then you're going to show up on Sunday morning being like, didn't work. It's not happening. Right? Jesus asks us to take the long road in the same direction, to continue to focus upon him, to continue to focus upon serving others. Because the reality is the fact that the service of others, it may not ever make a difference in their life, but it's going to make a difference in yours. And so will you trust the process? Because when we start to do, we can start to understand at greater levels the reality of when Jesus says, listen, I want you to love your enemies. How's that going? Or I want you to pray for those who persecute you. How easily does that happen? Or Jesus says, if someone wrongs you, I want you to forgive them. They wrong you again, I want you to forgive them. They wrong you again, I want you to forgive them. How does that happen? It's surely not an emotional love. It's surely not a love that says, this is all about me. To love the difficult people, to show acts of forgiveness, we need a committed, other-focused love. And so in order to get there, why not start to position yourself in such a way that you look for a love that doesn't first serve you, but is willing to serve others? Because when we do, we start to experience more of what God wants in our life. And others begin to notice the reality of God at work in our life. So this week, I'm sure many of you have heard the phrase, a random act of kindness. Heard that? Yeah? A little bit of acknowledgement's okay every once in a while. All right. Nice thought. Strike off the word random. Focus every day on intentional acts of kindness. Every day. Maybe you start your day by just simply saying, God, just give me the eyes to see how I can serve others. And at the end of the day, just kind of reflect upon the day and say, where can I celebrate what happened? Where did I fall down? But every single day, an intentional act of kindness. So you can posture yourself. You can position yourself to love as God has loved us. Let's pray. And so Jesus,